Welcome to the Fund the People podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Stahl. I'm president and CEO of Fund the People, where our mission is to maximize investment in America's nonprofit workforce. We give funders and nonprofits cutting-edge ideas, research, and tools to help drive equity, effectiveness, and endurance in the social sector. So let's start the show. Thank you for tuning in to the Fund the People podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Stahl. Welcome to the show. In this episode, you'll get truth-telling, inspiring insights, and practical guidance about how philanthropy and nonprofits can support Black community organizations and the Black nonprofit workforce in California and beyond. Our guest today is Kaci Patterson of Social Good Solutions and the Black Equity Collective. Kaci is founder and chief architect of the consultancy Social Good Solutions, which she launched in 2014. She also founded and leads the Black Equity Collective, a funder and nonprofit network housed at Social Good Solutions. Prior to her current work, Kaci held entry to executive level roles in nonprofits and philanthropy, leading capacity building, education advocacy, and social justice initiatives. She has managed multi-million-dollar grant-making portfolios in the U.S. and abroad, and she's created programs recognized as breakthrough contributions in the field, including an organization called BLACC, BLACC, which stands for Building Leaders and Cultivating Change, a grassroots social activism fund. Kaci was named a California Community Foundation Unsung Hero of Los Angeles for her work with the Black Fund. She was honored with the Wally Marks Changemaker of the Year Award by the Liberty Hill Foundation, and she was selected into the 2019 inaugural class of the Aspen Institute's Civil Society Fellowship. She sits on the boards of the California Wellness Foundation and Catalyst California, and she served as a state commissioner in the Department of Consumer Affairs from 2014 to 2022. I first saw Kaci speak at the Grantmakers for Effective Organizations conference, and I was blown away by her combination of the ability to speak truth to power from a place of empathy and experience, and her ability to get things done and lead in the field, lead others institutionally and interpersonally. For that reason and more, I'm thrilled to welcome Kaci Patterson to the Fund the People podcast. Hi, Kaci.
Hi, Rusty. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really good to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited. You do really important work, and I'm thrilled to get to share it here and learn from you. So you're a leader in at least several interwoven spaces, Social Good Solutions and the Black Equity Collective. So wanted to give you a chance to just share about each briefly before we go further. So I understand that Social Good Solutions is a consulting practice, but more than that. And you founded it to help clients operationalize equity. So tell us more about why it exists. Who do you work with, and what do you do to help institutions and people to operationalize equity?
So Social Good Solutions is a Black woman-owned and majority-operated consulting firm. So we work with philanthropy, community, nonprofit sector, really institutions that hold the public trust to advance racial justice and, as you described, operationalize racial justice. Because what happens a lot of times is justice and equity exist in our intellectual space. So we understand it intellectually, but we don't know how to put it into operational practice. And so how do we actually move what we believe to be right, justice, equity? How do we move those things from intellectual exercises into standard operating procedures when it comes to things like grant making programs, when it comes to things like hiring and how we sort of run our organizations top to bottom? That's really the work that we do as a consultant firm. So we run and manage philanthropic initiatives. So we work with donors, with philanthropies, with donor collaboratives, and we help to frame, design, manage, and implement initiatives that are focused on racial justice, start to finish. And that includes fundraising for those initiatives a lot of times. And we run as a firm about 5 different philanthropic initiatives that serve anywhere from 5 Black-led organizations as a cohort all the way to more than 100 Black-led organizations within a given initiative. And so the work is really, how do we demonstrate from a practical application perspective how to put racial justice and equity into practice so that as an institution, we're building muscle memory around it. And that becomes the way in which we behave so that our beliefs become our behaviors. That's the gap that exists in philanthropy right now, is that the beliefs around equity and justice don't match the behaviors around equity and justice. And so that's really where the firm comes in to help close that gap. Out of the firm, we founded the Black Equity Collective to really, again, be like a demonstration site, if you will, of what it means to practice racial equity in philanthropy by investing in the long-term sustainability of Black-led and empowering organizations. And to do that in a way that joins both funders and communities in that endeavor. Because oftentimes what happens is both funders and our community-based organizations, while they are working on these issues, they are often working in silo and not working together, not communicating in a way where they're designing together. So what we're doing with both Social Good Solutions as a consulting firm, but then putting into practical application with the Black Equity Collective is what we call community co-design processes, where we have Black leaders working with funders to design applications, RFPs, grant-making programs, and then put those things into place so that we have the ability to put the decision-making power into the hands of community about how resources get deployed. And we're doing so with the vision that we need strong, sustainable Black-led organizations that are working on the front lines of social change. And we need them to be strong, durable organizations to be able to fund their operations, fund their people, and that we can have grant-making programs that support that endeavor that are really designed by community, for community, with community, and that the decisions about how those resources get deployed are in the hands of the community.
Thank you for describing both things. I was curious, a lot of time Fund the People as an organization will try to do what we've called silo busting conversations or dialogue, where we bring together funders, nonprofits, and some of the intermediaries that support the field to talk with each other, to hear from each other what are the needs, opportunities, and challenges of investing in the nonprofit workforce from their different vantage points. And sometimes funders have a hard time showing up to those conversations for one reason or another. They don't want to hear it, or they're worried about being accused of something, or whatever it is. And a lot of times nonprofits have a hard time showing up to those conversations because they're worried about the power dynamics and all of that. Sometimes we'll have like caucuses where then they report out to each other. So it anonymizes feedback a little bit. I think it's so important to bring funders and nonprofits together to define the terms of action. And so I'm curious how, as a network, because it's described on this website as a network, I'm curious what it looks like when folks get together to have these processes. Like, how do you and your team facilitate that to make it productive and fun and effective?
Yeah. What you described is actually very common in our sector, where funders will typically meet together, and it's because they don't want to raise the expectation, right, of having nonprofits in the room, and completely understand that. Like, funders need to be able to work through a lot of the things that they're trying, what I call raggedy thoughts, right? Like they got to work through all their raggedy thoughts.
Right. They don't want the nonprofits to hear the raggedy thoughts or get their expectations raised by something that's said.
Right. Because then it's going to put pressure on the funders who may or may not be able to meet those expectations. So I understand it from that perspective. On the nonprofit side, it's done because they need to be able to have conversations outside of the gaze of philanthropy and outside of the gaze of having funders in the room. Both of those things are entirely valid. And I do not want to suggest that we don't need safe spaces for both funders and nonprofits to be able to have the private conversations with themselves. However, there comes a point when that actually becomes a negative result, because if you're continuing to work in silo, then the opportunity to collaborate on a deeper level gets missed. Mm-hmm. But those need to be highly structured and highly facilitated to help support both the sensitivities and to manage the expectations on both sides. And so there are opportunities within the Black Equity Collective where we do have nonprofits, our Black-led organizations are only meeting with each other. And then we host quarterly funder learning labs where it's only the funders that are in that space. And then we have deliberate space where they are together. And we curate that space. So, for example, we host an annual symposium where we have both funders and our Black-led organizations together at that symposium on purpose. Then we identify other projects. For example, when we are doing our community review body, that is the group of folks who are reviewing the applications that come in for funding from the Black Equity Collective Network. We have both Black leaders and Black funders sitting on that review committee. And so it really is a space for us to be able to engage in peer dialogue and really reinforce the value of mutuality in the space, that both have real assets that they bring to the conversation. And so why do only funders get to be in a decision-making capacity, right? And so it's a curated space where we really practice what it means to be in co-design and dialogue together and co-decision-making together. And then we've had another project and other projects where we will facilitate funders and Black nonprofit leaders working together. One of the signature things, and I think that's the event that you came to, the session that you came to at the Grant Makers for Effective Organizations conference, when we actually put together an evaluation framework that was really about redefining what it means to be an effective organization without using the narrow terms that we are so used to in our sector, which are about board development and governance and fiduciary responsibility. Like so often, those are just the narrow parameters around which effectiveness is defined. But we were having conversations where our Black leaders were saying, we don't think that sufficiently represents who we are and what it means in terms of the impact that we're having in community. Then at the same time, in separate conversations that we were having with funders, they felt like they didn't have the right sort of metrics to be able to really evaluate organizations based off of really equity-based values. And so how could they really do that in a way that made sense? There was no real framework for that. And so that really became the impetus for us saying, well, why don't you all work together? Because you're both identifying a barrier, a gap in the sector that is hampering you both from being able to do your work effectively. And so rather than complain about the insufficiency of it, why don't we actually create space for you all to work together to redefine what it means to be an effective organization using a broader set of terms? And so that's what the evaluation framework really laid out. And that was an example of how we had both funders and Black leaders working together over a 9-month period to create an entirely new evaluation framework that was really centered around redefining what it meant to be an effective organization.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that example. It's really helpful to hear about the structure you've created where there are those peer-to-peer spaces and then spaces that bring people together in a highly facilitated way. So let's turn to talking about the state of Black workers, broadly and in nonprofits. We've heard, or I just saw some new analysis of data from Candid, the research service about funding, and ABFE, the Association of Black Foundation Executives, showing that Black nonprofits, especially smaller ones, tend to be underfunded by foundations, and that the boost in funding after the murder of George Floyd was temporary at best. It's something I think most people in the field already knew or had talked about, but it was good to see Candid and ABFE partnering to share the data about that, and then that the Associated Press covered it as well. So since you encourage and help foundations to fund, and I like this language on your website, transfer funds into the community to help Black organizations become more self-sustaining, talk about what it takes to get funders to move more resources into the Black community through Black-led nonprofits. And if you want to talk about what transferring funds looks like as opposed to making grants, I'd be interested to hear about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, so this is really where I think the sector is at a pivotal inflection point. Because what I like to remind people is that equity is really fairly new as a term, as a terminology, only about maybe 10-ish years old in our sector. So there's not a lot of muscle memory and sort of tradition around what it means to do equity-driven work in philanthropy, right? So when you think about the Tax Reform Act of 1969 and the years between 1969 and about 10 years ago, philanthropy by and large was done a particular way for a number of years. And so to introduce the concept of equity in the last 10 years, and then to have racial justice and racial equity really come into the forefront of the sector's mind after COVID and the murder of George Floyd, we're talking even newer frameworks and even newer language that we don't have a lot of history around in the sector. And so if you put that into its proper context and you understand that in our sector, relationships are what really drive funding. And so funding follows relationship and follows trust. So what we at the firm do is we are adamant about building a better field of practice so that the relationship, the social gap gets closed between philanthropy and Black communities. If we can start to close the social gap, the relational gap, then we begin to close the trust gap. And then we can start to move into more transformative funding, because what happened is funders, for the most part, did not have relationships with Black communities prior to the murder of George Floyd. So lots of folks were scrambling to figure out, where do we direct dollars? Who do we give to? How do we actually, quote unquote, meet the moment? And there's a lot of sort of humanitarian crisis type funding that happens in philanthropy, where you respond to the crisis of the moment, but that response doesn't yield a relationship. And that's what we've seen in terms of the pullback in funding, that we didn't have relationships that could withhold and be withstood through the DEI backlash. We didn't have relationships and trust that was built and nurtured that could really overtake what has been a very antagonistic climate. And so we are reverting then back to familiar places, which was, we didn't do this work prior really to George Floyd. It was fairly new for our sector. And so reverting back to these very comfortable places because the relationships weren't there to hold us through the challenge and to hold us through the attacks that the sector has felt in the past year or so, really, which began, I would say, in 2023 and in 2024.
Yeah, because when was the court case on?
The court case was in 2023. That was the affirmative action case. And so that's when we really started to see the pullback. There hadn't been solid enough relationships built, deep enough trust established for us to be able to withstand that kind of pressure. And so that's really what has been the challenge. And so what it means then, to get to your question around how to transfer dollars, right, is that there has to be the conditions for sustainability. And the conditions for sustainability have to be baked in relationship, and they have to be baked in trust. And they have to be baked in us being able to, again, have opportunities to close the social gap that exists between funders and that exists between, by and large, Black-led organizations. And so when you have intermediary organizations like the Black Equity Collective, or you have these initiatives that Social Good Solutions manages, what you essentially have is a mechanism. You have the infrastructure by which that transfer can happen. So when you have the ability to actually hold not only large dollars, but you also have the ability to be a container for relationship building, then that's when the transfer really can begin to happen. And that's why we have to really continue to model and be really intentional around this kind of community co-design, because it creates spaces for peers to emerge so that it's not the grantor and grantee power imbalance, but that we're actually beginning to create a level of peer working relationships that are based in mutuality and based in trust and based in relational dynamics that can outlast an administration that is hell-bent on attacking everything DEI.
Yeah, it's very different to be at the same table hashing through an idea where you have a mutual goal that's beneficial to everyone, not just in one person's interest in this way and another person's, that's very different from the grantee-grantor dynamic. So I can see how creating those colleagues, those peers is a very different thing. In terms of smaller orgs, one thing I've noticed is every time I speak at a conference or a workshop or something like that in a local community, there's at least one person who comes, usually a Black woman, who says, I run this nonprofit, I'm not paid at all. Like I'm the executive director as a volunteer, and either me and my husband started it or we inherited it from a friend, and I'm doing it in my retirement, or I'm doing it, but I have this other job. And so they're like, well, how do I invest in our workforce when we don't have any paid employees? And I'm always like, well, do you want this to be your job? Do you want to be paid, or do you want to be a volunteer? Because either way is legit, not a scientific study, but usually they'll say, yeah, I would love it if it was my job. So I'm curious if you see that dynamic too in terms of community-based startup efforts, and like, how do you help those groups go from no staff to that level of, if they want staff, to be more robust and sustainable and have the funding to do that when they may not have any entry points to going and talking to funders.
Yeah. This happens all the time, Rusty. All the time. Because you and I both know, I think there's not a listener to your podcast who would disagree with the statement that nobody starts a nonprofit because every need is met. It's like every single person who has started a nonprofit has done so because either they personally had an issue that they experienced, their family experienced, their neighborhood experienced, their broader community experienced, where it was pervasive enough that they said, somebody ought to do something about this. And they looked around and said, well, I guess I ought to be that somebody. And that is by and large how nonprofit organizations are started. We are always trying to operate from this standpoint of what I call the we got us parts of philanthropy, right? Like we don't have a funding source to help us, but it's not going to stop us from serving the community because we got us. And so this kind of ethos exists all the time. What we found in research and work that we've done is that we did an economic impact report, because one of the things we know is that there's a narrative about lack and deficiency, underfunding of Black-led organizations, which translates to lack of capacity. And these then become reasons and excuses and narratives for continuing to perpetuate underfunding. And so what we wanted to do was to create a different narrative and to really show how our Black-led organizations are actually leading when it comes to economic impact. And so we wanted to study what that economic impact was. We had over 200, about 220 or so Black-led organizations across the state of California complete this survey that represents about a third of all BLOs in the state. What was remarkable about the data was 2/3 of those organizations are run by women. That won't surprise you. So Black women are running 2/3 of all BLOs in the state of California. The thing that was really remarkable to me is when you dug into the data even more, that you have these organizations that have provided over 4,000 jobs, over $330 million in salaries, $22 million in payroll taxes, and who they are hiring is really important. 71% of those surveyed organizations said that they had at least one person on their staff who had been system impacted.
Meaning the criminal justice system.
Criminal justice system, foster care system, homeless system. They had been system impacted in some way. They are hiring folks who are on the margins of the workforce to begin with. And they are giving them an economic opportunity, an opportunity to have dignity in work, to serve their community. And by the way, they have assets and a lived experience that really matters for the work of the organization. And so who they are employing and who they are hiring is having an outsized impact on the community, because not only are they then reinvesting their paychecks into the community and then paying taxes, sales taxes and other sorts of taxes, that also means that the state is not covering them as part of the systems that they are having to then fund, because you have organizations that are hiring them. And then if you break that data out even more, you start to see that our Black-led organizations, about 25% of them who took the survey, said that they spend over $100,000 of their operating budget on local small businesses. So they're also reinvesting in the small businesses, the caterers, the photographers, the folks who sing and do performances. They're investing in those folks who are in their community. So our organizations are really economic engines in our community. It's important that we start to see them that way and that we talk about them in that way. And it's important that the Black woman who started the organization as a volunteer starts to see herself as an economic engine and as an economic driver in her community, because that's the narrative that we need to lift up. And that's the story that needs to be told, because this is the kind of workforce that's being created when we make investments into Black-led organization. And it's why philanthropy needs to really step up to the plate and be much more accountable to the investment in Black-led organizations and not continue to perpetuate the disinvestment and sort of the struggle narrative that the AP article was really lifting up. It's to say that it's not really on the organizations as to why they don't, quote unquote, have capacity. It's really on the philanthropic sector as to why they don't fund those organizations who are driving social change, who are investing in local hires, who are investing in their local community and really pouring back into the community. It's really on philanthropy to do better in that regard.
Now, on this front of Black women in the workforce and in leadership, in our prep call, we talked about the Black recession and how the cuts to the federal workforce and other sort of shrinking budgets and whatnot, and maybe this DEI backlash is a big part of it, and anti-DEI policies, that Black women are being impacted in terms of their jobs more than anyone else, basically.
Not by accident, by the way.
Yeah, share your perspective and more info on this.
I'll just be frank and say that I see this as retribution, right? It's Black women voted against the current president at 92%. 92% of Black women voted in the other direction. And so this sort of backlash in DEI, this sort of elimination of jobs that have been fulfilled by Black women, it's not hard to see a correlation between an administration that is highly revengeful and the retribution But here's where I think is the real opportunity, because as a sector, we talk a lot about quote unquote capacity and what it means to have more capacity in our sector. If you really translate that, what that means is it's a skill set. It's a set of knowledge. It's a set of relationships that really help us to be more durable as organizations, as individual organizations, but then as a broader sector. So here's where I see the real opportunity is that there's so much talent sitting on the sidelines, so much talent, so much skill sets, people who have a lot of not only corporate skill sets, who have been in the public sector, people who understand what it's like to be on the inside of a government system, people who, for the most part, live and come from the very communities that we are serving, and that our missions are really designed to elevate, empower, and lift up. And what would it mean if we had that skill set on our side? If we had those folks working in our sector, advancing social change right alongside with us. So for me, the real opportunity that philanthropy has is to significantly invest in organizations' ability to bring that talent off the sidelines and to capture them into our sector so that we can build a broader, stronger, more durable and sustainable movement to really begin to push back and reimagine what it means to actually have a country that exists for all people. And there's no better place for us to do that than in the sector that is about really a dissent. It's our nonprofit sector is not only a social service sector, but it's a sector that is calling for a better way. It is a sector that is acting as the moral consciousness of this country. And when you defund our sector, you are defunding dissent. And so we actually need philanthropy to recognize that what's happening in the broader landscape is an effort to defund dissent. And that if we would put more money and put more investment in our ability to capture that talent, we could build an amazingly robust movement that can really withstand any of the headwinds that we're facing right now.
Yeah. Amen. There's so much talent out there. There's so many people who have lost opportunities for no fault of their own, whether it's in AmeriCorps or jobs in government agencies or other spaces in the nonprofit sector itself, all these layoffs that haven't really been addressed by philanthropy at this point. And it's really a disgrace that so many people's livelihoods are being ruined. And veterans too. I just heard about how like 10,000 veterans are losing their homes because the administration cut some kind of like support for veterans housing. So you have to imagine that's impacting the diverse set of groups who go into the military and serve the country in that way. But the denigration of public service in government and nonprofits, it goes beyond just the cuts to programs. It's a change in our culture.
Yeah, it's a change in identity. And it's this identity piece that I think is really pivotal in philanthropy right now. Mm-hmm. I can't speak for the rest of the country, but I know here in California, there are lots of funders who are going through sort of strategic refreshes. And that feels tone deaf in some ways because the world is literally on fire, a proverbial fire and literal fire. And we have a set of philanthropies that are sort of going through a process where they are figuring out what their next set of strategies and what their frameworks are going to be. But I want to say that while I do see it as tone deaf in some ways, I also see it as a necessary reset because for so long, philanthropy really existed in one way. There were very few funders who were thinking about their identity in relationship to the broader community in the way that we have funders doing so now. Because for so long, up until last year, funders were used to attacks coming to communities. They weren't used to attacks coming to them. Mm-hmm. And so when attacks started coming to them, it really caused the philanthropic sector, one, to be stunned, right? They were paralyzed just because, like, there's this joke that Mike Tyson always says, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face, you know? And so philanthropy really got punched in the face last year and had to regroup. And that regrouping is causing funders to reimagine their identity and their relationship to community in ways that I think are both necessary and helpful. And so while the process is painful because the timing couldn't be worse, I really believe that on the other side of this, we will have a better set of philanthropic partners because now they know what it's like to be punched in the face. Now they know what it's like to really stand in the shoes of their community partners to an extent and be attacked. They have a lot more resources to withstand the attacks than our community partners do, but they're in a different level of lived experience now that I think allows them to be not only more empathetic, but really desirous to be in more strategic relationship with their nonprofit grantee partners. And so I am actually very hopeful about what this moment will get us on the other side when we're able to actually see our way clear about who we want to be, who funders want to be in a sector that really needs them to reimagine their role in what it means to be in deeper partnership with communities.
Yeah. I am concerned. I mean, I'm glad to hear you're hopeful, and that's a really good perspective on maybe the pause that's going on. But there's also a set of new CEOs coming into major foundations across the country, and I hope that there is consistency and stability as well as transformation at the same time, right?
That's going to be the challenge and the key. Can you hold the tension of both, right? Of being consistent and sustainable in the moment while you're in the process of transformation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the work you do. And thanks for making time to share it with me and our listeners. Kaci, I really appreciate it. And I would love to put in the show notes for this episode the survey data about Black-led organizations. I think you have a report.
We do. Yeah, we have a report. We can share it with you. Absolutely. Happy to do that.
That would be amazing. And then also the data I mentioned about Black women and jobs is from the Economic Policy Institute. And so we'll put that study in the show notes as well, and links to your organizations and any other resources you send along that you want to share, we will post with the episode.
Thanks, Rusty.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to be part of the show and to share a little bit of our perspective and to hopefully give folks a little inspiration today.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to the Fund the People podcast. Visit fundthepeople.org and click on podcast to find the show notes and resources from this and other episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd really appreciate a 5-star rating and a quick review or comment in your podcast app of choice. It helps more people to find the show. To get the extended version of this interview, plus lots of bonus content, I invite you to join our Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/fundthepeople to subscribe today. Thank you for the work you do. Remember to keep your tank full, take care of yourself, and take care of one another.